Now let's take a longer look at this. Democracy. When we hear them shouting democracy, we believe that that is a universal value. Our foreign policy since the time of Woodrow Wilson has been based on the idea that the world must be made safe for democracy. To show we're nonpartisan, President Bush in his second inaugural said that freedom was a universal longing of the human soul. History tells us that is wrong. If we're going to think historically, if we are going to use the lessons of the past to make decisions in the present and to plan for the future, we must start with the clear historical fact that freedom is not a universal value. Many people in many places and in many times have chosen the perceived security of a strong but just ruler over the responsibility of self-government. And in fact, the Middle East, just like Russia, just like China, has always chosen a strong authoritarian rule over democracy. There is no history of democracy in the Middle East, except for Israel, which is the exception with its European ideals. There has never been a democratic government in China. In fact, in classical Chinese, there is no ideogram even for democratic freedom. And in the ancient Egyptian language, there was no word even for freedom. All power rested upon an absolute pharaoh. And so too in the other great center of early civilization, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, or the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, what we call Iraq today. There and in Egypt, both around 3000 BC, for the first time humans began to write, build monumental structures, use metal tools, and develop complex government organizations capable of irrigating the land and to have larger amounts of population. Both of those civilizations started and ended with absolute despotism. In Babylonia, the king was chosen by the gods to be absolute ruler. In Egypt, Pharaoh was the god. And these regimes are only toppled by demonstrations which break out when the people become too hungry, too oppressed by taxes. And all they want to do is topple the existing despot and get a new one in place. In pondering all of this, I was reading with my class the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one of the first great works of literature. And Gilgamesh was a real historical figure, a king of the city of Uruk, around 2700 BC. And so famous was he that an entire epic, like the Iliad, was developed around him. But it starts off with Gilgamesh being the absolute ruler of Uruk, but abusing his powers and making the people oppressed. So they finally get so upset that they have riots. And the gods listen to them, and they send down another hero to have a big fight with Gilgamesh, and they go off into sort of a self-imposed exile. The story of Joseph in the Bible is all about the Grand Vizier who grows powerful by showing Pharaoh the way even better to oppress the people. When there's a famine, remember? Do you remember the story?
Sure.
He gets Pharaoh to buy up almost all of the land. Then let's go out there suddenly a statement, then came a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Well, what obviously had happened is riots had broken out, and the Pharaoh, their first step is always to dismiss their Grand Vizier. It's all his fault. I didn't know this was happening. And so, of course, President Mubarak's first move was to get rid of his cabinet. It's all their fault. So all through the history of ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh would rule despotically, food riots would break out, and he would dismiss, maybe kill his Grand Vizier and appoint another one. So you always had a fall guy. But as long as Pharaoh was wise enough to keep the bread prices low, people will put up with almost anything. And this was also true when Greek rulers descended from Alexander the Great, and then the Romans ruled Egypt. The Romans understood that one, they must respect Egyptian customs, so every Roman emperor was crowned as Pharaoh. They must respect the Egyptian religion, because then as now, the religious leaders get the people started. So they would rebuild the temples, the Romans would, of the Egyptian gods, and then be sure to it that bread prices were really cheap in Egypt. When the Arabs conquered in 643 AD, the same system was put back in place. And all through the Middle Ages and all through the time right up until the British basically annexed Egypt, it would be one sultan after another, ruling for a while peacefully, keeping bread prices low, and then riots break out. He topples his grand vizier, appoints another. Sometimes you might last as grand vizier only 4 or 5 or 6 months, and you were not only toppled, you were generally strangled, and all your wealth confiscated. But it's a reminder of how people love a government job, no matter how risky it is. So this is what has happened again in Egypt. It's, of course, what happened in Iraq earlier. The successful transition of Turkey to Western ways after World War I was due not to democracy, but to an enormously capable dictator, Kemal Ataturk. Thus, there will emerge a strong man in Egypt. His goal will be to keep bread prices very low. And when I've been in Egypt, you will see an ordinary Egyptian coming out of the bakery just with huge loads of flat bread. They keep goats up on their roofs. They feed them that bread, which costs just dozens of loaves for a penny or two. And as long as they have that, then they'll stay reasonably quiet and calm. So food prices will be driven down. But I fear that such is the uproar now that a strong military man may not be able to control it, and that the Islamic fundamentalist will take over Egypt. The Middle East has no history of freedom. But the most basic sense of freedom in the Middle East is independence from foreign rulers, whether it's perceived as the British, or whether I think in this sense is perceived as us. There's great anti-American sentiment in Egypt, and it is going to grow stronger. The Middle East has its own dynamics. We do not understand those dynamics. And our attempt now for 3 generations to impose our Western values, including democracy, upon the Middle East is a tragic failure, and one very dangerous for us. The final lesson in this, and anyone will tell you this in a foreign country, particularly the Middle East, is America is a very bad ally to its friends. Mubarak has been our friend, and we just deserted him. And we have done that over and over again. I'm particularly amused when the press talks about these Democrats sweeping Egypt and this corrupt dictator who's been supported by American funds, and all they want is democracy. That's what they were saying in the 50s about Batista. And Fidel Castro was the great democratic leader who was going to bring freedom to Cuba. We fall for the same line over and over again. The historical span of the average American news person is about 4 minutes.